Hello, welcome to yesterday's Airlines Gemini Jet September releases dropped a couple of days ago, and it's time to take a look at them and see what I think. Now, looking at last month's Gemini pictures, most of them look like they turned out pretty well and as expected. So the Alaska and the Azul, they look really good, and other ones like the Delta A321, and the Delta 767, they kind of look about as good as they can look given the weaknesses of the molds. Not entirely sure what's going on with the nose landing gear on that Iberia Air Nostrum CRJ, but perhaps it's just the picture here. Hard to tell as always with Gemini photographs. And the Emirates A310, well, I got some criticism in my last video for not making this scrap metal. As always, when you look at Gemini's pictures, it's staged to look pretty good, but somebody else who works for Emirates, he sent me some pictures of the model that he'd got from the Emirates store, and it looked awful. So maybe I was wrong. Perhaps I should have scrap metaled that one. You never know. Anyway, but broadly, it's last month's set. Look, as you'd expect, pretty decent, no real surprises. And to be honest, that's kind of Gemini's lot, no real surprises. They're certainly playing to their core audience. They continue to do so. And this month's set, in many ways, is even more core Gemini than last month's set. But before we get into looking at those in a bit more detail, chuck a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, as always. And check me out at Instagram at YesterdayAirlines and on Facebook as well, and yesterdaysairlines.com, where I do a lot of detailed reviews and a lot of other content in the 400 scale space. But that's enough of that. Let's get on and check out Gemini for September. Okay, we've got 11 models this month. 8 are civil, 1 is very uncivil, and 2 are military. So, as always, we will start with the Airbuses, but I'll chuck the military ones on the back end of the video. First up is a model which isn't too surprising, but is nonetheless probably welcome for most people. It is a QantasLink National Jet Systems Airbus A220-300. The reg is VHX4B. I'm not sure why they're putting numbers in the registrations in Australia, but it's certainly a departure from historical practice anyway. Now, this one's not wearing the special Aboriginal scheme. I do believe that was announced as a future release, but it seems to have disappeared. Maybe they've got some licensing issues there, hard to say. This one's in the standard livery, which is really nice. I think I've said previously that I personally think that the upgraded Qantas scheme is one of their best ever, possibly their best ever actually. Like the way the roof looks, like the old roundel under the cockpit. Just think it's a classy update, and the best of these updates of the classic red tail scheme. The A220 is an attractive aircraft, and even though it is technically an Airbus, at least it looks a little bit different to your standard fare Airbus and Boeing. Now, in terms of the A220 mould that Gemini are using, which is obviously the JC Wings version, there have been about 20 A220s in general across the board in 400 scale. Some of those have been Herpa, but most of them have been Gemini or JC. And in the last 2 or 3 years, the majority have been Gemini, Air Canada, Air France, Breeze, Delta, ITA, JetBlue, and now this QantasLink. Now, the mould itself is okay, but has quite substantial issues towards the front, and those are both in terms of the shape of the front of the fuselage and the printing of the cockpit, which I'm sure I've talked about in these videos previously. The cockpit's way too small and not the right shape, and the nose is not particularly well shaped either. The rest of the mould looks pretty decent. These models definitely seem to sell well, and no one seems to be paying too much attention to the mould, which is a shame, but nonetheless, just be aware that it isn't that accurate. Even so, I think that this is still a worthy release, and for me, I'm going to put this one up in the high flyer. If the mould was better, then it would probably get supersonic, but I just don't think the mold is there, to be honest. The next model is Eurowings Discover, or as what is nowadays just called Discover, I think. The German subsidiary, another part of the Lufthansa group. This one is an A330-300 DAI Kilo Kilo. There had been a release last year, Kilo Alpha, which was made exclusively for Limox Wings, which is a German flight shop brand. That model appeared to be simplified. Basically, it's using the JC mold, but they didn't put aerials on it. Fundamentally, it seems to be the big difference here. This one is going to be a standard release, but it's going to be using the same mold. A perfectly reasonable but not outstanding A330-300 as the JC Wings one is. I would generally choose all of the other possible A330-300 molds over the JC one. The Phoenix one is better in my opinion, and certainly the NG and Panda ones are better, and the Aero Classics one is actually a better mold as well, albeit their printing isn't anywhere near as good. So yeah, it's not great, but it's not awful either, and I do have a few of these JC Wings A330s myself. It's definitely viable. I can't say I'm overly excited by the airline at all. The livery is a bit better than the previous Eurowings scheme, but still not overly exciting. I'm just going to put this one into Workhorse because it's been made before, the mold's ordinary, the airline's boring. Okay, and now we're into Boeing territory. And before I talk about the next model, I should probably address some criticism that I sometimes get, and that is politics. I've been reprimanded by a couple of commentators for daring to mention politics. Now, from where I stand, you can't get a much more political topic than airliners. The history of airliners, the history of airlines, the history of aircraft manufacturers, it's insanely political. And if you can't criticize the Equatorial Guinea government when discussing an Equatorial government aircraft, I find that to be ludicrous. You may go and buy the plane, I'm not saying not to get the model, but don't sit there and pretend that that model doesn't represent a pretty unpleasant regime, okay? I've got lots of models from unpleasant regimes, but I'm not sitting there pretending that the Russian government's nice. This is not controversial. Now, this model, next up, and the reason I'm bringing this up is it's a political model. I mean, it literally is a political model, and it's a political statement by Gemini as much as anything. It is the Trump-Vance campaign, 737-800. I think it's operated by Eastern Air Express. The registration is N917XA. None of that really matters too much. Now, I'm not going to go on about Trump and Vance and the meaning of this aircraft on this video. It's pointless. I'm not likely to change anyone's opinions on this topic. Obviously, from a European perspective, I think like 90%, probably more, of all Europeans look on in disgust at the state of the Republican Party, the lies, the actions, the words, the things that have been said and done, and are staggered that anyone could vote for these people. But regardless of that, let's look at the model. I mean, the livery is actually, it's not that dreadful, I guess, as these things go, but I'm not loving it, obviously. The mold is awful, really can't come soon enough, the suggested replacement mold, and I believe JCR are working on a replacement 737-800. So that's really not good at all. The fact that Gemini are making this model, I think, does talk to their political leanings. They have certainly, when you look at the previous models they've made, they haven't made previous Democratic leaning candidates. I'd be surprised if they made the Harris Waltz jet, which I saw, which has actually probably got an even worse livery than this one. Yeah, I mean, there's not much more to say really about this. I'm going to scrap metal this. I can't stand these people. and the mold is awful too. So take with that as you will. You want to get angry at me, go ahead. It's not something I'm going to change. Okay, moving on out of that morass of unpleasantness, and we've got next up a couple of Max is. I was saying Max is because even though they're both technically Max 8s, one of them's a Max 8 200, where you're jamming the people in Ryanair style. First one, however, is a standard Max 8, and this one's Alaska Airlines, honouring those who serve N806 Alpha Kilo. I like the Gemini JC Max 8. It's not as good as a couple of the others around, but it's still great. This livery is really nice. It's obviously been on a 737-900 ER previously. That's been made by NG, but nobody's made this new version that appears to have been very recently painted on to the Max. One thing to point out, though, here is that the artwork Gemini are showing here looks inaccurate. The photograph I've seen of the real aircraft shows 6 stars on the roundel at the front, not the 5 that are represented here. Be interesting to see whether Gemini recognise that and correct it, or whether they just carry on regardless and release this. Presumably they've had discussions with Alaska, seeing as they license these things, so you'd like to think they'd get it fixed. Hard to say, because it's a bit surprising to put out the artwork in the guise it is. So that's something to watch out for, and mainly because of that, I think I'm going to put this one into Workhorse. If basing it off of the artwork in its current guise, it's not correct, and the picture that I'm seeing of the aircraft definitely shows 6 stars at the front, not 5. Now the other Max, as I say, is a Max 8, but it's a Max 8 200. So this one's in the colours of Allegiant Air. N810MG is the registration. Allegiant, I don't think have had this aircraft delivered yet, but the aircraft has certainly been painted and flown. Must be coming up soon for its delivery. And you got to say the Allegiant scheme is pretty attractive and will look excellent on this aircraft, and does look excellent on this aircraft. Allegiant's, yeah, a funny airline, isn't it? It somehow kind of slips under the radar when a lot of American carriers are discussed, but has been obviously pretty successful. And despite being kind of a cheapy low-cost airline, has quite a classy scheme, which almost has that kind of classic national airlines feel to it. Yeah, I like this a lot. I think this will be a really nice model, and I'm going to put this one up into Supersonic. Taking us out of the 737s, and we've got a 757 this month. It is in the United Saul Bass scheme from the 90s. N536UA is the registration. Nothing wrong with re-releasing these. I mean, it's a re-release in a sense like, yeah, Gemini haven't made this before, slightly oddly, but it has been made before. In fact, it is one of the very first NG models releases that was ever made in April 2018, and I've got that model, and it is a really classy model. Obviously, the NG 757 is so much better than the Gemini JC one, but the Gemini JC one's still cute enough. It's not a train wreck by any means, but it never looks as good as the NG version. However, I imagine that NG United is super hard to find. This was from before NG were really popular. So I would imagine a lot of people never got a copy of the original NG release. There has also been an Aero Classics edition on the NG mold, but obviously without aerials and with significantly weaker finishes and printing in classic Aero Classic style. And yeah, that one's probably more in line with what you're going to get from Gemini. The Gemini will undoubtedly have better printing quality, and obviously it's got the aerials too. So I imagine there's quite a sizable market for this one, and it'll be okay. Damning with faint praise, but it'll be decent enough. I'm going to put it in the Workhorse for the reasons I've kind of talked about. It's been made before. The mold is pretty ordinary, but I completely understand why it's been made. It's not a bad model by any means. Next up is another 767-400 Delta, again in this case, and Gemini are slipping one of these out pretty much every month. and successfully getting them out ahead of competition from Panda Models and NG, which is a bit disappointing because these Gemini ones are obviously inferior in terms of the mold, which is, I've talked about a lot, is just pretty rubbish, frankly, especially for a mold that's from last year. It's really poor. This one, N845MH, is wearing the Breast Cancer Research Foundation. Colours the full-on pink version of those, not the pink ribbon version. It's the one which says Force for Global Good on it. It has actually been announced by Panda Models. It was announced a while back, but it's taken them a while to get the model out, which is disappointing, I imagine, for people. The scheme's a bit, well, it's very pink. But it's a good cause to support. And yeah, I wouldn't buy this because I'd have already ordered the Panda version if I was interested in Delta 764s. So for me, don't see any reason to order this when there's a much better version coming. Just need to wait a little bit longer to see that. The Panda mold knocks the socks off the Gemini. I'm going to put this one down in the gas guzzler. I'm slightly over being nice to this mold. It's just not good enough. Two more civilians to discuss. And next one up is a Lufthansa MD-11. It is DAL Charlie Charlie wearing the Farewell MD-11 Lufthansa scheme. This was made about 2 years ago by Phoenix. And their one looked, it looked pretty good. I actually personally probably prefer the Gemini JC MD-11. They've both got weaknesses. They're both old molds which have been updated. Tend to think that the Gemini version is slightly nicer. Gemini have made a Lufthansa Cargo MD in this livery before, but not with the special titles. They made DALCD in 2020. And that model looked really nice and put the extra titles on it, and I guess it will look better. So it's a perfectly good release. Lufthansa is obviously a core Gemini airline. It's surprising me that it's taken them a couple of years to get this out and not at the point that they actually did retire their MD-11, so that's a bit surprising, but should be a nice model. I'll put this one up into high flyer just about, I think. Perhaps a bit generous there, but hey. Last civilian model is another MD. It's an MD-90. Again, Gemini slipping out a few MD-90s, which is nice to see. Nobody else has the mold apart from themselves and JC Wings. This will be the 6th Delta MD-90 they've released, but the first one which is wearing the Colours in Motion livery. Now, the last month they made an MD-80 wearing the scheme. This month you've got the MD-90. This one's N910DN. I like their MD-90 mold. It's better than the MD-80 in terms of the form around the nose and the cockpit and the nose gear, which is surprising because they really should be pretty much the same in that region. I think this will be a really lovely model, and I'm sure this one will be mega popular amongst Delta collectors. So definitely a supersonic model for me in that group, which means when you look at the civil models here in the first 9, we've got a couple of models that I think are supersonic, a couple of reasonably solid high flyers and workhorses, and a couple of pretty rubbish models as well. So that's not too unusual for Gemini, I have to say. Now, 2 more models, and they're both military models, and I've been getting a lot more interested in military models recently, though I'm still not entirely sure where the boundaries lie for me, and I haven't got any of either of these types in my collection to date. First up is an Airbus A400M. This is the 5th A400M released by Gemini, and it has been nice to see that they've produced a range of different air forces for it. We've already had an RAF version, we've got a French version, we've had a couple of Germans, and this time around we've got a Turkish Air Force aircraft. So nice to see that diversity. As is usually the case with military schemes, there's not a lot to necessarily look at here, but there is a logo on the tail. I'm not entirely sure what the bird is. Is it a stork? Possibly it's a stork. Yeah, there's not much more to say. It's a good release. The A400M mould from Gemini looks nice. It looks like a nicely detailed mould from the pictures that I have seen. Nothing to say bad about it, really. I'm going to put this one up into High Flyer. And the last model is a C-17 Globemaster 2. United States Air Force, as the majority of the Gemini C-17s have been. In fact, I'm stunned. I didn't realise that this mould had been around so long. This mould was first released in 2004, so it's 20 years old. They've obviously updated it with aerials and probably better gear. But fundamentally, it's an old mould. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In general, the mould looks pretty good. It is a reverse cradle in the sense that the wings rest on top of the fuselage with a seam line. It's not the end of the universe, however, I would say. Now, in the last couple of years, they've been gradually slipping out various US Air Force and NATO versions for different wings. This one is part of the 436th Airlift Wing, which is based at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. It's known as the Eagle Wing, and you'll notice on the tail you've got the eagle ahead of the Dover logo. Again, as always with these military schemes, there's not a huge amount to look at, but you've got that tail flash. It's not unattractive. And if you're a collector of US military models, then I am sure this one will be welcome to you. And I quite like the look of the mould. I have to say I've never seen it in person, so I can't give a completely accurate description of its quality, but it looks decent enough considering its age. I'm going to put this one again up into High Flyer. I think there's definitely a market for these. Gemini knows there's a market. Lots of people like the US Air Force. And yeah, nothing wrong with that. So that's my roundup of this month's Geminis. It's a very Gemini set. You got United, you got your Delta, you got your Lufthansa, you got your Qantas, you got your Alaska. These are stock and trade Geminis. You've got a bit of right-wing lobbying with that Trump-Vance monstrosity, and you got some American Air Force and a bit of other American stuff thrown in. So it very much is, Gemini doing what Gemini does. I'm sure they'll keep on doing what Gemini does for many months in the future, and for a lot of collectors, that's a good thing. Personally, in the set, I don't think there's anything that I'll be buying, but doesn't mean there aren't some nice models. Close to getting that Delta MD-90, but just outside my collection range. Okay guys, well, hope you've enjoyed the video. That's my views. I'm sure that there are some Trump supporters out there listening to this, upset with me. Tough luck, I'm afraid. But that's my views on the Gemini releases this month, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye for now.